everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Today I'm excited to share my presentation title, Integrating Agency and Empowerment in Research with International Students, a phenomenological exploration of critical agency. So here is the agenda for today's presentation. I will first provide a brief overview of my dissertation project. Following that, I will make explicit connection between my project and the conference theme, focusing on how my project sheds some light on methodological and conceptual issues facing the field of research with international students. This will include specific references to questions that were included in the conference proposal pool. And then I will finally conclude with the Q&A session. So before I proceed with my presentation, I'd like to highlight 2 points. First, my presentation and insights that I share today are specifically rooted in the context of international students in U.S. higher education. Second, while my work is grounded in critical paradigms, I like to acknowledge that it is shaped by a specific academic training and socialization that I received in U.S. higher education. This is important to acknowledge as I constantly grapple with the tension between my aspiration for global, decolonial, anti-oppressive research and my complicity in perpetuating Western-centered research paradigm. So my dissertation project is titled A Phenomenological Inquiry into International Students' Critical Agency in U.S. Higher Education. So to share some backgrounds and context that inform my study, in recent years, there has been increasing scholarly research on international students' experiences with race and racism in U.S. higher education. For example, research has examined their experiences with racial discrimination, racial ethnic identity development, campus racial climate, and sense-making of race and racism. However, there's a lack of empirical research on how they actually resist and exercise their agency regarding systemic racism. So empowering narratives about this topic is particularly lacking. Additionally, I also argue that international students can serve as advocates and activists for racial and social justice, both in the US and globally. So I argue that this is an important area to investigate. So the purpose of my study was to examine how international students experience developing critical agency regarding systemic racism in a US context. An overarching question that guided my study was, what is the lived experience of international students as they foster critical agency regarding systemic racism? So the theoretical framework that I use, it's called critical agency. It consists of the 3 elements of critical awareness, sense of agency and urgency, and is defined as one's awareness of inequitable, oppressive social conditions and systemic violence against historically marginalized groups, and a sense of agency and urgency to address them. My study specifically focuses on international students' critical agency in response to systemic racism. I employed a phenomenological approach to understand participants' shared experiences of developing critical agency, and data was collected through 2 in-depth semi-structured interviews and demographic questionnaires. I ended up recruiting 18 participants hailing from 13 countries across the US who have demonstrated the development of critical agency regarding systemic racism. Participants' critical agency was determined based on their affirmative response to questions pertaining to 3 components of critical agency. I organized my findings into 3 core elements of critical agency and 3 sub-themes, including factors that shape each element, what the participants experience in the process, and the outcome of such development. So this structure allows for an in-depth exploration of each element. And I just want to highlight several key findings from my analysis. First, in alignment with existing research, my analysis further demonstrates that international students are indeed affected by and navigate racial dynamics and systemic racism in the US. Second, while prior research primarily focused on how international students are unilaterally influenced by these dynamics, my findings reveal that they're not passive. Instead, they develop critical agency and resistance against systemic racism, with some participants also engaging in advocacy and activism. Third, whereas previous research on international students tend to depict a population as lacking skills and abilities in adjusting to a host society due to deficit paradigms, my research shows that they draw on their transnational knowledge, experiences, and identity unique to their home context to develop critical agency. Additionally, participants' development of critical agency concerning systemic racism appears to extend to other forms of systemic oppression, highlighting broader implications of fostering this developmental outcome among international students. Lastly, my research also shows that higher education plays an important, significant socializing role in shaping international students' views toward racial and social justice. So now I'd like to make some explicit connections between my project and conference themes and questions explicitly stated in the conference proposal call. First, I'd like to discuss some conceptual methodological issues currently facing the field that I noticed in the process of developing my dissertation project. First, while more researchers have increasingly been employing asset and agency-based approaches to understand the experiences of international students, a prevalent deficit paradigm still persists. This paradigm focuses on the various challenges faced by these populations in a host society and institutions. While understanding their challenges is significant, focusing solely on their challenges and problems can unintentionally reinforce deficit perspectives toward the population and one-dimensional understanding of the population as simply powerless. So this connects to my second point, where research tends to homogenize groups, not only in terms of their identity, but also in terms of their positionality. So because of this patterns, it was a bit challenging to find sufficient literature centering international students' agency, empowerment, and intersectionality in the context of developing my research project, which would further enrich and provided more guidance on various aspects of my research. Lastly, still conceptual. Lastly, existing depoliticized approach toward internationalization of higher education and the mobility of international students often disregard the colonial, imperial, and racist foundation underlying these processes. In response, critical researchers in the field are progressively embracing more critical approaches, bringing attention to the ethics and power dynamics inherent in these fields. So I agree that this ongoing inquiry must persist to attain a more comprehensive understanding of the multifaceted factors shaping international students' experiences, identities, and positionalities. For example, engaging with these issues more deeply led me to delve deeper into international students' experiences with race and racism and how they develop agency and resistance against systemic racism. Quickly on a methodological note, for my project, qualitative methods was invaluable in really unraveling the complexities and nuances of understanding international students' experiences and their intersectional identities. And I firmly believe that the subfield will significantly benefit from employing various qualitative methods to generate more complex, humanizing, and intersectional understanding of international students, which appears to be an urgent task in advancing the field. Next, I'd like to discuss some practical consideration for research design in this subfield, drawing on lessons from my own dissertation project. First, in terms of macro factors, international students are influenced by larger political and environmental issues that directly and indirectly impact their well-being and their capacity to participate in research. Therefore, as researchers, it's important to be aware and mindful of potential political environments, both within the US or both within their host countries and their home countries that might affect their capacity to participate in research. Secondly, international students' participation in research may be constrained by specific rules and regulations of the institution that they attend, particularly those related to their involvement in paid research. So it is equally important to check and adhere to these institutional rules and regulations. And regarding micro factors, my participants, as I mentioned before, came from 13 different countries and really diverse. They were really diverse in terms of their cultural, national backgrounds, gender, sexuality, religion, and major. So I believe that as a researcher, a deeper understanding of each of my participants' intersectional identity, as well as some shared language, might have fostered stronger record and deeper insights. And lastly, it would be also useful, and it's also important to note that international student participants are really they are busy with their academic and professional lives and other priorities crucial to maintaining their status. Therefore, it's really important to be aware of their limited capacities and allocate sufficient time for participants and adjust the timeline of your research projects accordingly. So next, on to the question of how can researchers consider issues of power, inequality, intersectionality, and ethics in research with international students. And I like to offer some insights drawing also on my research. First, there should be deeper training, conversation, and knowledge about these issues, knowledge sharing about these issues among researchers in the subfields, facilitated through opportunities like this conference. This is particularly crucial given the lack of guidance on centering these issues in research with international students. Second, researchers should constantly reflect on their identity and positionality in relation to those of participants and openly communicate them with their participants. Next, researchers should continuously check their own biases and assumptions about international students as a group, which can be influenced by existing literature that is referenced. For example, in the context of my research topic, existing studies tend to portray international students' transition from being a majority in their home countries to minorities in US higher education and society. However, some of my participants were already minorities in their home countries due to their race, ethnicity, and religion. So it is really important for researchers to really take the time to understand the unique intersectional identities of international students. Additionally, while it is common for researchers to use generic templates for consent forms, it's also important to consider tailoring them to the specific experiences of international students. This might include incorporating sections that address how participation in research would affect their visa status, especially for research that deals with the critical social issues. Lastly, it's important for researchers to find various creative ways to amplify international students' voices and engagement in research. In my study, I conducted member checking by inviting participants to provide feedback on my summary of their interviews, and participants were asked to evaluate the accuracy of my summaries and my summary of their words and provide additional insights where necessary. While member checking requires time, I believe it's a critical step toward ensuring ethical practices and amplifying the voices of international students. And lastly, so bringing everything together, how might research with international students be imagined differently? What should the future of research with international students look like? Again, based on my own research. So the future research with international students that I envision would place greater emphasis on their assets and agency in various aspects of their academic and social lives. It would also center intersectionality to reveal the complexity and nuances in their identities, experiences, and positionalities. It would also engage more fully with the colonial races and imperial roots of internationalization of higher education to establish a more ethical, socially just, and equity-driven within the field. And lastly, I just like to conclude by sharing two quotes from my participants that underscore today's point about the need for integrating empowerment, agency, and intersectionality in research with international students without providing my analysis. So the participants, undergraduate participant from China who participated in my study says, it feels like they, the domestic community, are taking away this independent agency from us as international students, as human beings, and making us into a collective, very homogeneous singularity. And another quote that I wanted to share is from a graduate student participant from India, and he says, I don't have all the privilege in the world, but I have privileges in other ways. And I need to leverage those privileges to make things better for other people that don't have those privileges. So what I'd like to tell international students is to understand where their privileges lie and then own up to and take it up as a responsibility to do something about it. So that was it for my presentation. Here were some references, and thank you for listening.
I was wondering, like, so you